You already know what the Kennedys did to Carolyn Bessette. You watched it in the last video. The paparazzi, the isolation, the family that never accepted her, the marriage that slowly took everything she had, and the night she did not want to get on that plane. But here is what nobody told you. Carolyn Bessette was not the first woman the Kennedys destroyed. There was another one, 30 years before Carolyn. A woman who was younger, softer, and completely unprepared for what that family would do to her. A woman who came in with everything: beauty, talent, intelligence, genuine love, and left with almost nothing. Her name was Joan Kennedy. And the story of what happened to her inside that family is one of the most deliberately buried stories in American political history. I am Mary, and today we are going to talk about the woman the Kennedy family made invisible and then blamed for disappearing. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at the Kennedy family the same way again. To understand what Joan Kennedy lost, you need to understand exactly what she was before Ted Kennedy walked into her life. Virginia Joan Bennett was born on the 9th of September 1936 in Bronxville, New York. She grew up in a comfortable, stable family. Her father was an advertising executive. Her mother was elegant and composed. Joan was raised with manners, with music, and with the quiet confidence of a woman who had never been given a reason to doubt herself. And she was stunning, not in the manufactured way of a woman who worked at beauty, but naturally, effortlessly, undeniably beautiful. Blonde, blue-eyed, tall, the kind of woman who made entire rooms pause without trying. But here is what the world always skipped over when they talked about Joan Kennedy. She was not just beautiful, she was genuinely talented. Joan Bennett was a serious pianist, not a hobbyist, not someone who played at dinner parties to impress guests. A trained, disciplined musician who had studied seriously and performed publicly. Music was not something Joan did. Music was something Joan was. She met Edward Kennedy Ted in November 1957. She was 21 years old. He was 25. Their introduction was arranged through her college, Manhattanville College in New York, the same college his sisters had attended. Ted Kennedy arrived on campus, charming and broad-shouldered, and carrying the full weight of the Kennedy name, and Joan Bennett, who had never had a reason to be guarded, opened the door and let him in completely. They were engaged within a year. Married on the 29th of November 1958 at St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Bronxville. Joan wore a white gown with a cathedral train. Rose Kennedy, Ted's mother, approved of the match. Joan was beautiful, Catholic, well-bred, and manageable. She fit the template perfectly. What nobody told Joan on her wedding day was this. She was not marrying a man. She was being absorbed into an institution. And that institution had very specific requirements for the women inside it. You smiled at the right moments. You stood in the correct position in photographs. You produced children. You did not complain. You did not draw attention to problems. And above all, you did not embarrass the family. Joan Kennedy had no idea what any of that meant yet. She was 22 years old and in love. And for a brief, small window of time, she was genuinely happy. That window did not stay open long. The first crack came before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. Ted Kennedy had affairs. This is not speculation. This is not tabloid invention. This is documented, confirmed, and acknowledged by people who were in that marriage and in that family. Ted Kennedy had affairs from the very beginning, and he was not particularly careful about hiding them. Now here is the detail that most documentaries skip entirely. Joan found out almost immediately. Not years into the marriage, not after children. Almost immediately. She was a newlywed. A woman who had married in good faith, who had given up her own developing life to become a Kennedy wife, and within the first year, she understood that her husband considered their vows to be suggestions rather than commitments. What did Joan do? She did what every woman inside the Kennedy family was silently trained to do. She said nothing. She smiled in public. She appeared at campaign events. She stood in the correct position in photographs. She performed the role she had been assigned. But here is what that silence cost her. Joan Kennedy had no template for what she was experiencing. She had come from a stable home. Her parents had a real marriage. She had no model for how to survive what was being done to her. And the Kennedy family, the institution she had married into, offered her no support, no acknowledgement, and no permission to even name what was happening. Rose Kennedy, Ted's mother, had spent decades mastering this silence herself. Joe Kennedy's affairs were legendary. Rose had responded by deepening her Catholicism, by focusing on her children, by becoming so publicly composed that the pain underneath became invisible. This was the model Joan was handed. Smile, endure, continue. Joan Kennedy tried. She genuinely tried. She had 3 children with Ted Cara, born in 1960, Ted Jr., born in 1961, Patrick, born in 1967. She campaigned for him tirelessly. She stood on stages in front of thousands of people and spoke warmly about a marriage that was quietly destroying her. She learned to perform contentment so well that even people close to her did not fully understand what was happening behind closed doors. And then in July 1969, something happened that changed everything. Something that the Kennedy family handled in a way that told Joan exactly where she stood and exactly how little she mattered. Chappaquiddick. I am going to tell you the full Chappaquiddick story in part 4. But I want to plant this question in your mind right now, and I want you to hold it until the answer comes. Because the question is not what happened at Chappaquiddick. The question is, what did the Kennedy family ask Joan to do afterward? And what did that ask reveal about everything they truly thought of her? The 18th of July 1969. Ted Kennedy attended a party on Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts. He left the party with a 28-year-old woman named Mary Jo Kopechne. His car went off a bridge and into a tidal channel. Ted Kennedy escaped. Mary Jo Kopechne drowned. And Ted Kennedy waited approximately 10 hours before reporting the accident to the police. Mary Jo Kopechne was somebody's daughter. She was 28 years old, a campaign worker, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She died in the water, while Ted Kennedy, by his own account, went back to his hotel, slept, and contacted his lawyers before contacting the authorities. Now, here is where Joan Kennedy enters this story in a way that has never been fully told. Joan Kennedy was pregnant when Chappaquiddick happened. She was carrying their 4th child. The Kennedy family's crisis management team assembled immediately. Advisors, lawyers, political strategists. The full machinery of one of the most powerful political families in America mobilized within hours. And one of the first decisions that machinery made was this. Joan Kennedy needed to appear publicly beside her husband. Composed, supportive, loyal. She was pregnant. She had just learned that her husband had been in a car with another woman, that a young woman had died, and that her husband had waited 10 hours to call for help. And the family's response to her shock and grief was to hand her a public role to perform. Joan Kennedy suffered a miscarriage shortly after Chappaquiddick. The family did not pause. The political strategy did not pause. The appearances did not pause. And here is the detail that I cannot stop thinking about. In the weeks following Chappaquiddick, as Ted Kennedy gave carefully managed interviews expressing remorse and political survival, Joan Kennedy appeared beside him, dressed perfectly, composed perfectly, performing the role of the loyal wife for the cameras, while privately she was grieving a lost pregnancy, processing a public humiliation, and beginning to understand something about her marriage and her family that she had been trying not to fully see. She was 32 years old. Now here is the question I want you to hold, because the answer comes in part 5, and it is the moment that everything inside Joan Kennedy finally gave way. If the Kennedy family had acknowledged Joan's pain after Chappaquiddick, if someone had sat with her, had said this is not acceptable, had given her permission to be a human being instead of a prop, do you think what happened next would have happened? I already know your answer. And the saddest part is that the Kennedy family knew too. They just did not care enough to act differently. Joan Kennedy began drinking. I am not going to frame this gently or euphemistically because Joan Kennedy herself did not frame it gently in later years when she finally spoke about it honestly. She drank to survive what was being done to her. She drank because the Kennedy family had created a situation in which she had no other permitted outlet for the pain she was carrying. She could not speak publicly about Ted's affairs. She could not express anger about Chappaquiddick. She could not grieve her miscarriage with any public acknowledgement. She could not step back from campaign appearances. She could not be anything other than the composed, beautiful, loyal Kennedy wife that the institution required. So she drank privately, and then less privately. And then the drinking became the story, because the moment Joan Kennedy's struggle became visible, it gave the Kennedy family exactly what they needed. A narrative that was about her weakness rather than their cruelty. Here is what the Kennedy family did, and this is the cover-up that has never been fully named. Instead of acknowledging that Joan Kennedy's drinking was a direct response to years of public humiliation, private abandonment, forced silence, and the specific trauma of Chappaquiddick, the family allowed the narrative to become, Joan has a problem. Joan is struggling. Joan is the difficult one. Ted Kennedy gave interviews in which he expressed concern for his wife while continuing his very public social life with other women. The Kennedy family machine, which had spent years crafting narratives and managing stories, did nothing to protect Joan's reputation or to contextualize her struggle honestly. They let her become the cautionary tale while Ted remained the political titan. And here is the specific detail that tells you everything about how the family operated. During Ted's 1980 presidential campaign, his serious challenge against Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination, Joan Kennedy, was brought back into public view. Cleaned up, styled, coached. She gave interviews. She appeared at rallies. She spoke about their marriage with warmth. She was doing this while the marriage was effectively over, while Ted continued to live a life entirely separate from hers. While she was privately in treatment for alcoholism, the family needed the image of a united Kennedy marriage for the campaign. And so, Joan Kennedy was called upon to perform that image one more time. She did it, because she had been performing it for 20 years, and she did not yet know how to stop. But something was different this time. Joan Kennedy was beginning slowly, painfully, at enormous personal cost to find her own voice. And that voice was going to say something the Kennedy family had never permitted any woman inside their institution to say clearly. No. Joan and Ted Kennedy divorced in 1982. The divorce settlement was private. The terms were sealed. Joan Kennedy received a financial arrangement that was by all accounts substantial, but the specific details were kept from the public in a way that protected the Kennedy family's image far more carefully than it protected Joan's dignity. Now here is what happened after the divorce, that almost no documentary about Joan Kennedy addresses directly. Joan Kennedy disappeared. Not immediately, not completely. But over the years following the divorce, as Ted Kennedy remained one of the most powerful senators in the United States, as the Kennedy family continued to dominate American political and cultural life, as the Kennedy name continued to carry the full weight of its mythology, Joan Kennedy faded from the public narrative almost entirely. She was not invited to Kennedy family gatherings in any meaningful way. She was not included in the carefully managed Kennedy family image that the next generation continued to cultivate. The woman who had campaigned for the family for 24 years, who had stood on stages and smiled and performed loyalty through humiliations that would have broken most people, was quietly set aside the moment she was no longer useful. Her children Cara, Ted Jr., Patrick, remained connected to their father and to the broader Kennedy family. Joan's relationship with her children was complicated by her ongoing struggle with sobriety, and the Kennedy family's influence over that narrative was significant. In a family where image management was institutional policy, Joan's visible vulnerability made her the problem in every story she appeared in. In 1992, 10 years after the divorce, Joan Kennedy was found wandering in Boston, disoriented. She was hospitalized. The story made the news briefly. The coverage focused on her condition. Almost none of it focused on what a decade of isolation, of being erased from a family she had given her entire young adulthood to, of watching the man who had destroyed her marriage remain celebrated and powerful. What all of that had done to a woman who had never been given permission to grieve any of it. And here is the detail that tells you exactly who the Kennedy family was when the cameras were off. After that 1992 incident, after it became publicly clear that Joan Kennedy was in serious crisis, the family's response was not to rally around her. It was not to acknowledge any responsibility for the conditions that had contributed to her situation. The response was managed distance. The kind of careful, PR-polished non-involvement that protects a family's reputation while a woman drowns. Joan Kennedy was 66 years old when Ted Kennedy died in August 2009. She attended his funeral. She sat in the church where the Kennedy family gathered to mourn the man who had spent their entire marriage humiliating her, who had driven a car off a bridge with another woman and waited 10 hours to call for help, who had allowed her to become the story of his family's most painful chapter rather than its victim. She sat there with composure, because composure was the one thing the Kennedys had trained her to perform perfectly. And even at the end, even at his funeral, Joan Kennedy gave them exactly what they had always required from her. Here is what the world said about Joan Kennedy for 50 years. She was fragile. She was weak. She could not handle the pressure. She had a drinking problem. She was not strong enough for the Kennedy world. And here is what the world never said. She was a 22-year-old woman who married into an institution that had zero interest in who she actually was. An institution that required her to perform loyalty to a man who openly humiliated her. That required her silence after Chappaquiddick. That called her back for a presidential campaign while she was in treatment. That disappeared her the moment the divorce was final and she stopped being useful to the family image. Joan Kennedy's drinking was not a character flaw. It was a rational response to an irrational situation. It was what happened when a human being was placed inside a system that had no mechanism for her pain and no permission for her honesty and no interest in her survival beyond what it could extract from her publicly. And yet, and this is the part that history almost never gets to, Joan Kennedy survived. She got sober. She completed a master's degree in music education at Lesley University in Cambridge in 1,991 inches, her mid-50s, after the divorce, after the hospitalizations, after all of it. She performed publicly as a pianist. She gave interviews in which she spoke with clarity and without bitterness about what her life had been. She did not perform composure, she performed honesty, and it was the most powerful thing she had ever done. The question is not why Joan Kennedy fell apart inside the Kennedy family. The real question is how, after everything they did to her, she ever put herself back together at all. Joan Kennedy is still alive. She is 88 years old. She lives quietly. She is not part of the Kennedy family's public narrative. She is not invited to the reunions and the commemorations and the carefully managed events where the family presents its mythology to the world. The woman who gave 24 years of her life to that family, who campaigned, who smiled, who stood in the correct position in thousands of photographs, who performed loyalty through humiliations that would have ended. Most people exists now at the complete margin of the story she lived at the center of. Ted Kennedy died in 2009 as one of the most celebrated senators in American history. His legacy is preserved in foundations and legislation and documentary films and eulogies that describe him as the Lion of the Senate. His affairs are mentioned briefly. Chappaquiddick is described as a tragedy. Mary Jo Kopechne is given a paragraph. Joan Kennedy is given a sentence. Here is what I take from the life of Joan Kennedy. She was not destroyed by her own weakness. She was destroyed by a system that identified her value as purely ornamental, that extracted everything useful from her and discarded the rest, and that then constructed a narrative in which her response to that destruction became the story rather than the destruction itself. This is not unique to the Kennedy family. This is what powerful institutions have always done to the women inside them. They take, they use, they silence. And when the woman finally breaks under the weight of all that taking and using and silencing, they point at the breaking and say, "You see, she was always the problem." Joan Bennett was 22 years old when she married Ted Kennedy. She was a pianist. She was brilliant and warm and completely unprepared for what was waiting for her inside those doors. She deserved someone who protected her the way she protected them. She deserved to be seen the way she saw everyone else. She deserved a story that was told honestly while she was still living it, instead of buried so deep that it takes a channel like this one to finally dig it out. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Joan Kennedy is 88 years old. The Kennedy family's legacy is still celebrated. Ted Kennedy is still called a hero of the Senate. Does that feel like justice to you? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this story moved you, please share it. Because Joan Kennedy gave 24 years of her life to a family that made her invisible. The least we can do is finally make her visible. Next week we go deeper. A woman who inherited one of the greatest fortunes in the world and paid a price for it that no amount of money could ever have been worth. Subscribe so you do not miss it. This is Mary of Shadows. Thank you for being here.